Prynhawn da, pawb. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really pleased to welcome you to this ExChange Wales webinar. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Louise Roberts. I'm part of the social work team at Cardiff University, and I'm also part of our research centre, Cascade. Before I introduce our speaker, Beth, today, I just wanted to do a quick plug for the Reframing Adoption Conference series, of which this session is a part. Hopefully you will have joined some of the webinars, or you've looked on the page already, but if you haven't, the conference webpage and the link Sian has just put into the chat is really worth a visit. There's so many resources on there. You can catch up with previous webinars. There's recorded presentations and videos. Just before we were coming on now, we were talking about some that we've really enjoyed. So there's one on there with Jane Pilcher and colleagues about name stories in adoption, which was really interesting. And there's a lovely recording, which is very relevant to today's session, featuring Abby and Rosie, a birth parent and an adoptive parent, talking about their relationship. So they come highly recommended, but there's a wealth of resources on there. So podcasts, blogs, artwork from young people, working with Adoption UK. So please, I can't recommend it highly enough. Have a look if you haven't already done so. So today's session then, we are thrilled to welcome Professor Beth Neil. This is not the first time that we've welcomed Beth to a Cascade ExChange Wales event. Beth previously gave the annual adoption lecture, which was excellent. That was back in 2021. And that's still available to view if you missed it on the ExChange Wales webpage. So that session, like this one, was really well attended, and we're thrilled that Beth has come back. So the plan for today is for Beth to speak for about 45 minutes-ish, so we will have some time for questions at the end before we finish at 1 o'clock. So as we're going through, if you would like to post questions or comments in the chat, you're more than welcome, and I will make notes of them, and then I can pose some of them to Beth at the end. But we're also happy, if you'd like to ask your question verbally, when we get to the end of the presentation, just raise your hand, and then we'll come to you, and Sian will unmute you and you can ask your question. Okay. So as you can see on the screen, the title for today's presentation is Modernising Birth Family Contact in Adoption, a Theory of Change. To formally introduce our speaker, Beth Neil is a Professor of Social Work, Director of Research and Chair of the Research Ethics Committee for the School of Social Work at University East Anglia. Before joining the department as a PhD student in 1996, progressing to a lecturer in 1999 and senior lecturer in 2007, she worked for several years in social care and social work. She teaches on qualifying and post-qualifying social work programs and supervises PhD students. Beth's research interests are in the field of adoption, including post-adoption contact, birth relatives' perspectives on adoption, post-adoption support, and adoptive parent recruitment. Beth, thank you for being with us today. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Louise, for that introduction. It's lovely to be back. I think this talk really is builds on the talk that I did in 2001, which was about maintaining children's relationships and identities in adoption. So I'm going to talk about this piece of work I've been doing with colleagues at UEA to try and develop a kind of a roadmap for where we need to go when thinking about birth family contact in adoption. I mean, this slide, I'm not going to read all these quotes, but the point I want to make really is now I think there has been a growing realization over the past 5 years or so that we do need to change our approach to birth family contact in adoption. It's now kind of everybody's saying it. I felt for many years You know, I felt a bit of a lone voice or a few other voices, and now I think there's lots of voices saying we need to change this. So, you know, from the president of the family courts, Andrew McFarlane, talking about it in 2017 and 2018, the BASWA inquiry into ethics and the role of the social worker in adoption, highlighting this issue. And I think this third quote from the House of Lords Committee that reviewed the Children and Families Act kind of gets to the heart of the problem, that actually if we don't modernise our approach to contact in adoption, it can be a threat to adoption itself. So there's now lots of different voices saying we need to have a new approach to contact. What I'm also going to talk about today is we can't just think about what do we do, how do we change our practices to help children today. We have to think about the literally hundreds of thousands of people who have been through the adoption system since 1929. You know, a substantial number of whom will still be alive, who've been affected by closed adoption practices. And what are we doing to help those people? So I'm going to talk about services for adults affected by adoption, as well as think about planning and supporting contact for children being adopted today. It's interesting that this is an issue that Adoption UK have highlighted in the past couple of years in their adoption barometer. Last year, they reported on adoptive parents' kind of views and experiences of birth family contact. And I think the contribution that made is to show that actually the mood amongst adoptive parents around birth adoption, around birth family contact is changing. And a lot of adoptive parents are willing to promote children's links. And a lot of adoptive parents are frustrated by the system that prevents them doing that. And this year, they really highlighted the views of adult adoptees as well. So lots of calls for change. So kind of in line with that, the work that we've been doing has been funded by the National Adoption Team in England. I've been working with a number of colleagues at UEA who I've listed at the bottom, and we've been working quite closely with the National Adoption Team, with a maintaining relationships subgroup with the Post PAC UK. So lots of people involved in this work. We've tried to incorporate existing and emerging new research into the theory of change. I mean, we've got Louise mentioned, you know, I started my research in this area in 1996. So we've got 25 plus years of research on this topic at UEA, but other people have been researching it as well. And new stuff's coming out all the time, like the adoption barometer and the big consult. I don't know if people saw that, the survey of adopted adults and birth parents that the Post Adoption Centre have recently published. So we've been trying to incorporate findings from research. We also last year carried out rapid consultation with focus groups and interviews with people with lived experience from all the relevant groups and with practitioners. We also worked with PAC UK last year looking at a survey of adopted adults. So some of you will have seen that the theme for National Adoption Week in England last year was maintaining relationships. I mean, that in itself is almost a paradigm shift, shifting from the focus on recruiting adoptive parents to thinking about children's lifelong needs. And to fit in with the theme of that week, the national team asked Post Adoption Centre to survey adopted adults to say, what do you think? What is the importance to you of maintaining relationships? Is it important? What are you thinking about this issue? And we help them analyse that data. So I'm going to talk briefly about that. We also carried out a piece of research last year using freedom of information requests to find out about intermediary services and how they were working for adopted adults and birth relatives. Specifically, we were looking at how agencies were responding to requests to check files from intermediary services. So there's all sorts of information coming into this theory of change. I think probably what I'm going to talk about today is lots of ideas that are already very familiar to you, but I suppose what we're hoping we can offer is putting it into some kind of order and structure that helps us understand where we need to go next. So any theory of change, you have to kind of really start by thinking about why is it we actually need to change? Why is it that maintaining birth-family relationships is important to adopted people? Well, we've known this for many years, many pieces of research, research from that's published in the last fortnight, research that was published in the 1970s, all underlines the needs of the adopted person to know their life story, to know their identity, to know their roots. And if you don't maintain any connection with your birth family, it's much harder to know that. It's also about loss that we know adopted people experience. And that can be the loss, for children in contemporary adoptions of brothers and sisters they've known all their life, grandparents, parents. It can be about those lived relationships, but it can also be a covert form of loss, as this quote shows from the PAC UK survey, of not having the chance to have a connection with brothers and sisters, parents, grandparents. There's a huge diversity amongst adopted adults about how they feel about adoption, about how they feel about these issues. But in the survey, the PAC UK survey, there was really overwhelming support from adopted adults for the idea of maintaining some sort of connection. So I think, yes, it's about the needs of the adopted person across the life course, which needs that have not been well served by closed adoption. But it's also, we know that closed adoption has not worked well for birth parents and other members of the birth family, that losing a child to adoption is a form of disenfranchised loss. It's a loss that other people don't recognize and necessarily support you with. And it's an ambiguous loss, as we see in this quote, which is from a birth mum in one of our studies at UEA. If you don't know where your child is and how they're doing, it's very difficult to resolve that loss. And you're maybe always thinking about them. As this birth mum said, it's always on your mind. So, the theory is really that if birth parents can maintain some sort of connection with their children, they can cope better with this loss. But I think it's also really important to remember, we're often quite alert to the value and importance of birth family contact for adopted people and birth relatives. And we maybe think of it as something we need to ask adoptive parents to kind of put up with or endure. And we need to think about the value and importance of this to adoptive parents themselves. So the video that Louise talked about of Abby and Rosie, an adopted mum and a birth mum, I really recommend you watch it. It's so moving. But the adopted mum said, I thought that contact was the right thing to do for my child, and I thought it would help birth mum. She said, I just didn't think how much it was going to help me and how much it was going to be meaningful to me. So we do need to engage with the idea of what are the benefits of this for adoptive parents. So we know under a closed adoption system that there can be barriers in the relationship between parents and children because there's this closed atmosphere, because nobody wants to kind of talk about the birth family. It's kind of a secret in the family. And what we've learned from our research at UEA and other research is that where there is efforts to maintain relationships with the birth family, whether that's through meeting up or whether it's through writing letters, that can create an openness within the adoptive family that provides opportunities for the child and the parent to talk and think about all their feelings around adoption, not just the child's feelings, but the adoptive parent's feelings, because both have to cope with the reality that there is another family out there. So there's benefits of maintaining relationships for adoptive parents in terms of creating this open relationship with their child. So can birth family contact, which I think, yes, there's problems with that term contact because it's rather cold and clinical, but it is a useful umbrella term to capture a range of different ways of staying in touch. Can contact benefit children's well-being? Well, the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory published a review of research studies looking at the links between contact and children's well-being. They published that 3 years ago. And the conclusion was, as you know, all the research I've carried out shows, yes, it can benefit children, but it depends. It depends on the quality of the experience. And we need to stop asking the question, can contact benefit children? We know it does. We need to say, how can it? How can we set it up in a way that it will? So as this review concluded, we need to think about how we can facilitate positive experiences and meaningful involvement of people who matter to the child. So we've you know, changing our approach to contact in adoption is not just about more children having more contact. If we do that without paying attention to the quality of contact, we're not going to solve those basic problems and we may do harm. So we have to focus on the quality of contact, which involves not just it being a pleasant and rewarding experience, but it being a safe experience. We need to listen to children and young people's views. We need to not just look narrowly at birth parents, but think about the whole of the birth family. Make sure everybody's clear about what they're doing and why. We need to make individualized contact plans, not have a cut and paste mentality, and we need to put support in where people need that. So here's a really good roadmap. First of all, here, what do we need to think about when changing our approach? And that's based on, you know, a lot of research. So what are the problems with what we're doing currently? So the predominant approach to birth family contact in adoption for many, many years now has been to set up mediated letterbox contact between the adoptive family and the birth family. That's the most frequent form of contact. It has been for many years. It still is, although I acknowledge that practice is changing around you know, different parts of the UK. So what is the problem with letterbox? The main problem with letterbox is it doesn't work in far too many cases. That you know, a few years after adoption, actually the majority of children with letterbox are not having any contact with their birth family. It's failing. So they are effectively in quite a closed adoption scenario. So why isn't it working? Well, people have talked about the actual format itself, that writing letters is quite an outdated format. These exchanges of information are very infrequent. They're usually just once a year or twice a year. So you're sending a letter off to somebody you don't really know. There's a lack of feedback loops. You sent your letter off and you maybe don't even know have they received it, let alone what did they actually think about what I've written. And there's lots of delays in the system with this communications going backwards and forwards. Then there's the problem of what to say. And it seems that we have had quite a risk-averse culture here, that people might get quite a lot of guidance about what they shouldn't say, that often there is advice not to make these letters kind of too personal or too emotional, or not to maybe use certain terms like don't say I love you or don't sign it from mummy. There's kind of a risk-averse approach, but when we talked to people last year and in all our research about what's a good experience of letterbox contact, people say something that feels personal, something that feels meaningful, something that brings that other person to life, something that makes me feel I actually have a connection to them. But what people told us is often these letters feel quite anodyne, like a business letter. They can make you feel disconnected. So there's lots of problems here, and there's a lack of support for people writing these letters, both the practical problems and the emotional problems, which is unsurprising, really, given the huge numbers of letterbox cases that agencies are trying to support. And then there's another problem, that this is a form of contact that is set up initially between adults, and the adults don't always know when and how to bring the children into it and make it work as a kind of a communicative tool with children, or a way for children to learn about their family and identity. So there's lots of examples where parents, kind of hold back telling their children, even children finding out about this contact when they're quite, they're teenagers or even young adults. So where contact does need to be indirect, we need to be aiming for something that is more rewarding, because people won't keep it up if it's not rewarding, that is more informative, that people can sustain, and that children are part of. Where do we need to go with face-to-face contact? Well, first of all, we could think about the language we use. We could, instead of saying to children, we're setting up face-to-face contact with your birth family, we could say, we're going to keep in touch with your mum and dad or your brothers and sisters, and we're going to meet up from time to time. That might start to change the feel of it a little bit, because there's a number of problems with direct contact. The first problem, I would say, in adoption is the lack of opportunities for adopted children to actually continue to meet with people in their birth family. It's rarely considered. It's considered for the minority of adopted children. And in this regard, adopted children are treated quite radically differently to children who remain looked after, to children who leave the looked after system and who are in kinship care. Those other groups tend to stay in touch and have the chance to meet up, and the adopted children don't. So that leads to what one of the adopted adults we talked to last year really emphasised: unnecessary loss. So loss runs all the way through adoption, like, the writing through a stick of rock. You can't get away from it. It's inherent in adoption. But where children have people in their birth family who they value, who are meaningful to them, who are safe, and who can make a contribution to them in their lives, and we cut that off, that is building in unnecessary loss, and we need to stop doing it. But also, when we do keep contact up, there can be problems with quality. So meetings can feel unsafe. Sometimes we don't always pay attention to the risks, and direct contact won't be right for all children or with all birth relatives. But we also have this growing situation where direct contact is happening, initiated by the adopted young person or their birth relatives, usually in the context of people being unsatisfied with the formal means of keeping in touch that have or have not been set up. So, I think if we can get the approach better, we can reduce the number of situations where young people experience this risky contact. We also have other situations where the contact does happen and it's kind of safe, but it doesn't feel family-like. It doesn't feel rewarding. It feels quite cold and clinical. So we need to be where we need to go. We need to aim for every child to consider, is there anyone in their birth family they can continue to meet up with? Who is it? We need to look across the whole of the child's networks to see who is, a safe and meaningful person. We do need to focus on safety and quality and supporting plans and reducing the need for people to take matters into their own hands. So I'll expand on some of these ideas as we go on. So what about those other large group of people that I talked about, adults affected by adoption? Well, the PAC UK survey, the consultation we carried out last year, the AUK survey published I can't remember if it was last week or the week before, the adoption barometer, has highlighted the massive issues affecting this group of people. There's three main areas. So trying to find out information about yourself and your life story, accessing records is a problem. Trying to reconnect with your birth family, or for the birth family to reconnect with the adopted person, massive problems. And getting therapeutic support with the impact of these losses and these identity problems, as well as the impact of early harm that might relate to separations, maltreatment, massive problems. So for people seeking help, adopted adults and their birth relatives, just the first problem is how to go about it. So it's quite interesting, looking at adoption agency websites. Imagine yourself to be an adopted adult and you want to do any of these three things I've listed. Where's the information? Often it's not on the front page, it's not on the second layer, it's not on the third layer, it's buried right deep inside there somewhere. We need to have much better signposting so people know where to go. But even if you know where to go, a lot of services need to be paid for and people can't afford them. There's really different systems to look at different sorts of records. There's different systems for adopted adults depending on the year in which they're adopted. There's different systems and rules for birth relatives as opposed to adopted adults. So it's a very complex and labyrinthine system. When you do get your records, the quality of what's written down might be quite poor. It might be very thin if you were adopted a long time ago. It might be copious if you're adopted very recently, but a lot of it might be redacted. And you have to wait and wait and wait to get it and to get an intermediary service. And there's lots of challenges for the service providers. So, in both England and Wales, adoption has been regionalised. And so actually where all these records have held has moved around. Agencies have closed down and different people are now responsible for managing access requests, so that the system has been kind of disrupted by regionalisation. Most of these files are like in the picture, they're paper files, they're not digitized. When it comes to adopted people putting vetoes on their files, which they have, or vetoes on contact, which they have a right to do, the government guidance suggests that agencies keep central records of this, but our research we carried out last year suggested that the vast majority don't. So if you want to find a veto, you've got to rake through the files. People providing services who specialise in services to adults affected by adoption. We've seen a number of agencies closing down, like After Adoption, St Francis Children's Society, other specialist providers closing down. There's restrictions on who can provide intermediary services and therapeutic services. The government is currently consulting about the need for therapists to be Ofsted registered because they're realising that that is restricting the pool of counsellors and restricting the availability of help. And, there's aspects of the regulations and practice guidance that need updating. So there's huge issues here, many of which are practical and financial, but we also have to remember, as the quote on shows, that it's a massively emotional area. And this really came across in the survey, the PAC UK survey last year, that adopted adults were saying, we need help with all of this. We want to maintain relationships. We want to access our records. We want to reconnect with our birth family, but we are anxious about this. We're frightened of what we might find. We've got so many emotions about it. We need to be emotionally supported with this. So we need to address all these problems as well. So when we think about what the problems are, I think there's a number of overarching themes for our theory of change. Probably it starts with actually questioning our own narratives around adoption, our own values, our own assumptions, because I think what we're talking about here is a paradigm shift. We need to really get away from the idea of adoption as a clean break, a fresh start. The past doesn't matter anymore. That's irrelevant. You're in your new family now. But all those kind of narratives, we know that is not the psychological reality of adoption. There's other unhelpful master narratives like, you know, all birth families are dangerous. Some birth relatives will be dangerous in some situations for some children, but, you know, there's a lot of narratives about the dangerousness of birth families that we need to question. There's also narratives around, you know, adopted people being kind of lucky and special and chosen that we need to challenge as well. So there's a lot of work around challenging master narratives. We do need to focus a lot more on the lifelong needs of the adopted person. This is one thing adopted adults really emphasize in their survey responses, that we feel our needs often come secondary to the needs of other groups, professionals, adopted parents, birth relatives, whatever. You know, adoption is about us, it happens to us, and we need to have more say. We do need to rethink risk. We need to address risk, but not be overly risk averse. We do need to think about increasing resources and focus on these issues. And I think in terms of adoption policy, certainly in England over the past 10 years or so, the focus has been on other things. It's been on adopter sufficiency, reducing delay, more support for adoptive families, all of which are massively important, but we haven't had a focus on these issues, and now we need to. And in terms of moving forward and creating change, we have to build understanding and collaboration between lots of different groups. So I think what I want to talk about now is, in thinking about this theory of change and how we move forward, the solution has to look at the whole system. So I'm not very good at drawing these kinds of things, but this is sort of my vague attempt just to map out some of the people involved. I mean, it's interesting, whoever you talk to about openness in adoption, you could pick any person on this group and they would say, you know, they talk about the limits on what they can do. So, you know, adopted people themselves, I've said, have constantly emphasized their lack of control. These decisions were made on our behalf when we were too young to have input into it. But as we grew up, nobody asked us. And now we're an adult, we feel, you know, we maybe still, there's limits to our autonomy and control over what we can do. If you talk to adoption social workers, they say, well, we have to kind of work around the plans that the child's social worker makes. If you talk to judges and lawyers, you know, they might say, well, we can only look at the plans that the child's social worker puts before us. If you talk to adoptive parents, they say, well, you know, we want this contact, but we can't get the agency to help us, or the birth parents don't write back. So all these people are interlinked, and we need to look at everybody in the system. I've just put a little star. You see a little star between the birth parents and the adoptive parents. I think this idea of collaboration, what we know about when and how contact works, it works where birth parents or birth relatives collaborate constructively with adoptive parents and vice versa. So that's moving forward. We need to think in terms of bringing people together, helping them collaborate, helping them build a relationship. And I think with our risk-averse approach and some of our master narratives, what we often do in our professional practice is try and keep people apart. And we need to kind of rethink that. So, for different groups, there's maybe a different focus of professional practice. So with adopted people, our practices we need to ask, how can we amplify adopted people's voices and needs? How can we give adopted children, young people, teenagers, adults more agency? For birth relatives and birth parents, we need to kind of focus on including people more, because we know that birth parents have needs that predate adoption, that go right back in their childhood. We know they have needs that are created by going through an adversarial adoption process, and we know that they have needs that are a result of the loss of the child to adoption. So they need a lot of support in order to participate in contact planning, in having a constructive role in their child's lives after adoption. So inclusion and support. For prospective adopters, we do need to focus on helping prospective adopters, think about and engage with these issues and feel confident moving forward with maintaining relationships with their child's birth family. So a focus on how we prepare adoptive parents and how we match children to adoptive parents. And after the adoption order, we have to recognise that adoptive parents have ongoing needs, not just how do they continue to support the contact, but how do they continue to have these conversations and answer their children's questions as they get older. And we need to think about, reviewing contact plans when things change. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, with the professionals groups, people have varying amounts of power, but nobody has all the power. With local authority social workers, they're responsible for kind of keeping children's links going right from the point they enter care, mapping out who the important people in the birth family are, keeping them engaged. A lot of children lose contact with their fathers even before adoption. They've got a key role in contact planning, but they often don't have the expertise in adoption, because adoption can be a small part of their caseload and turnover can be high. So we actually need adoption social workers and to collaborate and work together with local authority social workers to get those good plans for children. I think adoption social workers do have a key role in the theory of change on driving change, because they do have expertise in the lifelong impact of adoption. And I think they need to think about their role in driving change at an individual level, getting the right plan for individual children, but driving system change as well, working with all these other professional groups. IROs, I think, have a key role, again, making sure relationships are not lost at an early stage, and they're involved right up to the point of the adoption order. So that's an important role, because CAFCAS and another group often might not be involved after the placement order. So legal professionals, I mean, I would tend to think of people like lawyers and judges especially as people who have power. There's a lot of power in the law. The law says we have to think about the lifelong needs of the adopted child, the impact of them of loss. We have to think about their identity. We can make orders for contact if we want to. But you talk to legal professionals and they don't always feel they have the power. They feel that, they can only work with the plans that are coming forward. They feel they have to listen to adoption workers who say, tell them about the pool of available adoptive parents and what they're prepared to consider. But I think legal professionals do have to, have a key role in ensuring the quality of contact planning, questioning what people are saying, not just accepting it. And the child's needs need to drive the matching with adoptive parents and the recruitment and preparation of adoptive parents, not the what adoptive parents say they would like to do should not drive the contact plan that the child ends up with. That is the tail wagging the dog. So I think there is some more scope for courts to use their powers to ensure that relationships that are really essential to the child's well-being don't get lost, particularly maybe ensuring that contact continues after the placement order. And I think there's a really important role for independent support workers for birth parents, helping them participate at an individual level in contact with their child, but also helping birth parents participate in system change. For example, preparing and supporting adoptive parents to come and speak to groups of prospective adopters. Gosh, 5 areas for change, and I've got just a few minutes. So I think these are the 5 areas we need to look at. I've already mentioned a lot of the ideas. So in terms of just the process of change, the ideas here are drawn from particularly what change is already happening, who's already innovating. We're seeing that some agencies are innovating, and what seems to work is to have one person or a working group leading on this, making it a priority, having a working group looking at maintaining relationships in the agency, considering your own values and use of language and building in-house capacity. And then the adoption team can start spreading out the learning around those other professional groups, and they can work with people with lived experience in moving the change forward. And in terms of, sometimes it can feel like there's a mountain to climb with everything that needs to change. But, it's important to remember we can't do everything all at once, setting concrete measurable goals. So, if you're sitting down and thinking, right, let's move forward, you might want to think, okay, in the first 6 months, we're going to have a look at our adoptive parent preparation. We're going to have a look at the messaging on our website, or we're going to look at sibling contact, or we're going to look at initial meetings between adopters and birth relatives. But, maybe you can't do everything all at once. So there's, we have to think about putting these systems in place to make the change. We do need to think about preparing and matching adoptive parents. We need to set clear expectations that this is an important constituent part of adoption, but we also need to create space for adoptive parents to explore their feelings, their fears, their anxieties. So that we're not just changing what they say they will do, but we're changing their hearts and minds. And again, involving people with lived experience is really important here. Getting adopted people along to talk to prospective adopters, using films, videos, podcasts, meeting birth parents, etc. We need to make child-focused contact plans. So I've talked about adoption workers being involved in that. We need, there's a range of contact planning tools, and I think they're really useful where we are concerned about risk. We need to, questions our assumptions about risk. We need to consider all types of contact and what could work, including maybe digital options, which are starting to come on board. And we need to recognize that sometimes we cannot get the final contact plan when we're going through contested proceedings. And we need to, because everybody's in too much of an uncertain state, we might not be able to engage birth parents at this stage, but try again later. So keep the door open. In terms of digital solutions, I think there are different tools coming online, things like ArcBox. LetterSwap is a tool that's currently being piloted that we're involved in evaluating at UEA. And we see that people starting to kind of, maybe use messaging, WhatsApp, or online platforms such as LetterSwap, changing the format can change some of the dynamics of contact, can make it feel maybe more meaningful, more interesting to children, more frequent, more engaging. But, it's not a straightforward solution unless we change our thinking about what we're doing and why we're doing it. Just moving it onto a different platform won't change the outcomes. I do think, as I've said, we need to think about the underpinning relationships in all this, the relationship between birth parents and adoptive parents, between children and birth relatives, between the adoptive parent and the child. So we need to have kind of a relational way of thinking about this, not thinking in terms of letters and meetings, but what are the underpinning relational dynamics? And finally, for those adults affected by adoption, there's lots of work we need to do here. And probably the most important thing is to raise the profile of this work. That needs to happen, from the government downwards. And we need to invest in all these areas I've put on the screen. So that's really kind of our ideas about where we need to get to. The National Adoption Team in England are sort of wanting to move forward with a lot of these. So here at UEA, we're doing ongoing work around trying to change the culture. And I know there's ongoing work happening in Wales as well. And you've got some great practice guides around contacting adoption and things. So hopefully we are going to move forward and make some change. So that's it. And I'd love to hear questions and comments. And sorry, I've just run over by 3 minutes.
Oh, thank you, Beth. That was excellent. It was so clear and just really considerate and thorough, look at what needs to change. We have had some lovely comments and questions in the chat. So just a reminder to people, if you do want to ask a question verbally, just raise your hand and we'll do our best to come to you. But I'll start with some of the questions that were put in the chat. So the first is from Chris Holmesquist, who's from Adoption Wales. So when we did the plug at the start for the video with Abby and Rosie, Chris was responsible for editing that video and supporting that with Dr. John Simmons, and he's also written a blog that's on the web page as well. So he asked, do you feel that plans for contact are too often strongly influenced by a short-term perspective of the child's needs rather than their lifelong needs? Is it possible that a risk-averse culture that seeks to protect children is actually instead influenced by an unconscious impulse by adults to protect themselves from difficult emotions, or for professionals to avoid blame if something goes wrong?
Yes, and yes is the quick answer to that. Definitely. I mean, I think in terms of children's short-term needs, I think a key way how we see that play out is, the young age at which children are adopted, and the fact that almost half of adopted children actually are removed at birth. So they often don't have the chance to establish a relationship with people in their birth family before adoption. And then that is often seen as a reason why they do not need particularly direct contact after adoption. Or they don't really know their birth parents. They don't know their brothers and sisters. And that is thinking too short term. We need to think about the risks of not giving them the opportunity to develop that relationship. We know all the research about people who have kind of a reunion in adulthood are saying how difficult that is when you've had nothing for so many years and then you try and create something. Whereas, what I've seen in my research is if you can keep something going, then it can grow and it can evolve and you can make an informed decision about what you want to do next. So, yeah, I think we need to not dismiss the prospect of contact because children have not had the chance to live with their birth family. We need to, look at that 2-year-old who's before the courts, who we're making an adoption plan for, and we have to ask, what are they going to be thinking and feeling when they're 15? What questions are they going to have? What capacity are the adoptive parents going to have to answer those questions? What might they think and feel and need when they're 25, when they have their own children? So we've got to project into the future, which is why I think involving adopted adults is really key to creating change here, because they're people who can speak about those longer term needs and bring it to life and help help adoptive parents imagine their child into the future. And I think, why are we so risk averse? I don't know if we're just trying to manage the emotional complexity of adoption. We think if we tidy it up, it's, the more I work in adoption, the more I just feel how intensely emotional, complex, ethically, psychologically, emotionally, legally it is. And this kind of, well, let's just tidy things up, let's just keep it minimal, let's keep people separated. Is it a way to try and deal with that emotional complexity? I think the impulse to protect children who've already been harmed is important, and we mustn't lose it. But sometimes what we think of as a risk needs a lot more interrogation. So particularly I would highlight one of my bugbears: kids who are separated from their siblings, and the siblings might be older, they might be looked after, they might be with relatives, they're seeing the birth parents. And for whatever reason, we don't want the younger adopted child seeing the birth relative. Well, the first question I'd say is, well, why not? Could that happen? But if it can't happen, we might think, well, the adopted child can't see the older sibling because they're seeing the birth parents. And we think that that is the risk. That's not the risk. What's risky about that? Take it to the next stage. Well, the risk is that the children might talk to each other. I would say, yes, they will. That's not a risk. It's only a risk if something bad happens as a consequence of that. So you might think, well, the older child might talk to the birth parent. That's the risk. That's not a risk unless something bad is going to happen as the consequence of that. So ultimately, we're asking, is this birth parent the type of birth parent who would do something dangerous if they received any information about this adopted child? That's the risk we need to ask about, not, are the siblings seeing the parents? That's the risk, right? We cut off that contact. So we need to really interrogate what the risks are more closely. Sorry, that's a long answer. I'll shut up now, but really good points, Chris.
Thanks for that. So we've got another question, an interesting question from Shamim Raj, who says, can we have a view on how we can consider contact for a child who has a birth parent abroad and no way of knowing how to connect? How do I cover this magnitude of loss for this child in their APR?
Well, I think you're starting in absolutely the right place, because you are recognizing the magnitude of loss. So I think that's the first step, because I think sometimes where birth parents can't be found or contact is not possible, there can be kind of a sense of relief, or, well, we don't have to worry about that. That's a disadvantage. Whenever children cannot stay in touch with anybody, that is a disadvantage, that is a loss. I think it's about gathering as much information we can about the birth parent, and sometimes that is nothing. And when it's nothing, we have to think, well, what else is going to be meaningful to that child? So I'm kind of, I suppose in my mind, I'm thinking about children who may be adopted from abroad, but your question was about a birth parent who is abroad. I mean, is there somebody in the extended family that can provide some information, or who could keep in touch? If there's absolutely nothing, that person is just not known and you're never going to find anything, then it's maybe also thinking about the culture, what can we how can we make sure that the child is going to understand the culture that their parent comes from, because that's part of them and who they are. So it's just, trying to get whatever we can, because adopted people will say anything is better than nothing. And then it's about actually engaging with the idea that it is a loss not to have this. So, to work with adoptive parents to get them to understand how they can create space for their child to express that loss, to maybe, kind of memorialize the parent that they've never met. It might be lighting, you might never know who that parent is, that, a father in another country, but you could light a candle on Father's Day and you could talk about how it feels not to know your dad. At least the feelings can be supported, they can be out in the open. It's not like the child is getting the message, this doesn't matter. It does matter. So a few ideas there.
Okay, so I'll just do one last one, and this is from Beth Wade. And she says, I agree with what you were saying completely. I work with birth families after adoption and get very frustrated with annual letterbox contact arrangements when I can see that birth families could manage face-to-face contact in a positive way. I think children's social workers see the risks because they're involved when the family are in crisis. This means that they're very wary regarding post-adoption contact. I liked what you said about adoption social workers collaborating with children's social workers in contact planning. How could this be implemented, I wonder?
Okay, well, I think, some agencies are experimenting with the adoption social worker actually kind of becoming the child's social worker at an early stage. So that may be one way it might happen. But what some agencies told us they were doing, where they weren't doing that kind of case holding thing, is, when adoption is identified as the plan for the child, setting up a meeting with the child's social worker, maybe giving them a kind of an information leaflet about different types of contact, talking through different options with them, helping think through what's possible, providing a different perspective, and saying, let's work on this contact plan together. I think there is also, an important role for birth parent independent workers as well. And I think, because children's social workers work so infrequently, maybe with adoption cases, some agencies are kind of saying, there's when they get a new social worker, they're kind of having an initial meeting with them and just trying to sort of pass on a lot of information about kind of the lifelong impact of adoption and what it means. And so it's kind of doing that work on an individual basis. And then maybe people are doing it at more an agency level. So one adoption agency in England, for example, have put on a conference and they've invited their local authority partners. So, they're running the training for children's social workers to kind of educate them. So some ideas there.
Great, thank you. We've had a couple of requests to share the slides. Obviously, we'll share the recording of this webinar. Would you be happy if we shared a PDF of the slides, because people said they want to share them and go over them again? So that's
absolutely, yeah. I want people to use them, and even if you just pick up, one idea from one slide, and you go away and do something about it, that's what I want, really.
Perfect. So we're at 1 o'clock now, so I'm gonna not ask any more questions. If you could answer the poll that Sian has just posted, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much, Beth. That was excellent, and there's lovely comments in the chat. So have a look at those. And thank you everybody for coming. It's great to have such a strong attendance. Diolch yn fawr iawn.